From The Mad March of the Innocents, a tale of the Shepherds Crusade. I was just a boy, no older than 14 summers, when I first heard his name, Stephen. We were mending nets along the marshes near Cannes, the sea wind cold against our cheeks, when old Father Guillot came limping down the road from the priory with a face like stone and eyes like fire. "A shepherd has seen the Virgin," he said. That was how it always began back then, not with kings or soldiers, not even with bishops. It began with boys in fields, dreaming under the sky. And Stephen was just that, a shepherd lad from Cloy-sur-Loire, barefoot, penniless, and filthy with the stink of sheep. Yet by midsummer, he would command tens of thousands, peasants and pilgrims, pickpockets and prophets, all of them marching south, following a child with the fire of God in his eyes. But let me tell you the truth, not the songs. You won't find this tale in any good church ledger or royal archive. It wasn't a crusade, not in the holy sense. It was a madness, clothed in wool, fed by hunger, and sharpened by the wrath of forgotten men. And I saw it with my own eyes. Stephen, they said, was a quiet boy. Never cursed, never drank, never raised his voice. His father died under a nobleman's horse. His mother wasted away from the salt rot. He tended sheep for coin and slept in the chapel stable. He wasn't educated, but he could recite every line of the Psalms by heart. Then came the dream. It was spring, just after the thaw. Stephen claimed he saw the Virgin Mary appear to him in a shaft of sunlight while he watched over his flock. She didn't speak at first, only wept. Then, in a voice that was like thunder muffled by silk, she commanded him, "Go to the Holy Land. Let my poor. I will open the sea." That's what the pilgrims repeated as they marched. She will open the sea. Word of his vision spread like fire on dry thatch. He began preaching on the village steps, surrounded by ragged children and old women with broken teeth. Monks came to hear him, and even they wept. Stephen spoke not with anger, but with sorrow, sorrow for the Lord's land, sorrow for the sins of men, sorrow for the lost crusaders who died without seeing Jerusalem. He told the poor what they had waited centuries to hear. You, the broken, shall reclaim the kingdom, not with sword, but with faith. You do not need iron, for God shall part the waters for you. By the time he turned 17, he was already more pope than peasant in the eyes of the masses. I met him once, or rather, stood in the dust as he passed through Rouen with his followers. He looked nothing like the Messiah the rumors described. His tunic was plain, his sandals worn through. His only possession was a crude wooden cross slung over his back like a soldier's spear. But his eyes, they were not the eyes of a boy. They were the eyes of a man who had seen angels, or devils, or both. Beside him marched children, hundreds of them, barefoot, singing, clutching bits of bread and scraps of parchment with Latin prayers scrawled in chicken blood ink. Behind them came mothers carrying infants, toothless old men clinging to staves, and half-mad preachers shouting scripture until their throats bled. Somewhere among them, my brother walked. Jahan, 15 years old, full of spite and longing. He had left with no farewell, only a stolen loaf and a ribbon from our mother's sewing box. I followed Stephen's march not because I believed. I followed because of my brother. France was sick in 1320. The crops had failed again that spring. The nobles taxed us to the marrow of our bones. The king, Philippe Lalonde, was too busy scheming with his court in Paris to care about the grain rotting in our cellars or the dead in our fields. But worse than the hunger was the silence. God, it seemed, had stopped answering. The priests still chanted their Latin and swung their censers, but their churches felt cold and empty. The bells rang hollow. When people saw Stephen, they saw not just a prophet, they saw a reply. So when he said the sea would part and the children would walk across dry land to the Holy Sepulchre, they believed. Why wouldn't they? Everything else had failed them. We walked 15 leagues a day, following the trail of dust and footprints the crusaders left behind. Along the road, others joined, peasants from Burgundy, miners from Limoges, outlaws from the woods of Poitou. They came not out of faith alone, but out of desperation. Some believed they would find paradise in Jerusalem. Others hoped for a loaf of bread or a place in Stephen's shade. Many came for violence. Though they wore crosses stitched to their cloaks, they carried clubs under them. The first town to resist us was Peronne. They barred their gates when the mass of children and vagrants approached. The mayor had heard rumors that we were no holy army but a pack of wolves in wool. He wasn't wrong. The crowd grew restless. A boy threw a rock. Another shouted that the Jews in the town had gold hidden in their cellars, and that it belonged to the Lord's poor. Stephen said nothing, and in that silence, the madness took root. It started with fire. A synagogue burned before nightfall, its scrolls tossed into the street and trampled underfoot. The town guards fled. Many of them were peasants once, and they feared the mob more than their oaths. By dawn, a dozen homes were in ashes. 3 Jewish families were dead. More vanished into the woods. I looked for Jahan amid the chaos. I saw a child with red hands and a broken lantern, crying into his sleeves. I saw a monk praying while the crowd looted a chapel. I saw Stephen standing on the hill above it all, staring down at the flames. His face was pale. His lips moved, but I couldn't hear the words. Was it a prayer? A lament? Or just another prophecy? No one knows what he saw that night. But the boy who had spoken of peace and miracles never again walked alone. From that day on, he was surrounded by armed men, zealots with clubs and knives. His inner circle called him the Shepherd King. That was the beginning. The journey to Toulouse was still weeks away. The deaths, the heresies, the betrayals, all of it was still ahead. But in that ruined town of Peron, as the smoke curled toward heaven and the cries of the broken echoed off the walls, I realized something. This was no children's crusade. This was a reckoning. And God help us, it had only just begun. France, in the year of our Lord 1320, was not a kingdom but a wound. The kings in Paris wore crowns heavy with jewels, but the fields were starved, the wells were dry, and the prayers went unanswered. Those of us born in the shadow of cathedral spires knew hunger like an old friend. The harvests had failed twice in 10 years. Grain rotted in warehouses while rats danced in the granaries of lords. A boy could work a field until his bones cracked and still not have bread for supper. And the church, the church, it had grown fat on indulgences, so bloated it could barely look down to see us drowning in its shadow. I was too young to know the word for it then, but later I would learn it. Despair. It seeped through the cracks in every thatched roof. It hummed in the songs the washerwomen sang down by the river. It lingered in the eyes of men too proud to beg and too broken to fight. France was not dying quickly. It was rotting, slowly, silently, from the inside out. That is the world Stephen preached to. They say he spoke in tongues, that his voice could turn stone to bread, that birds perched on his shoulder as he walked. I remember none of that. What I remember is this. When he spoke, men wept. Not because of miracles, but because, for the first time in their lives, someone told them they mattered. You, he would cry, pointing at some filthy boy with lice in his hair, are as worthy as any knight of Jerusalem. And when he said that, they believed him. No priest had ever said such a thing. No noble had ever looked at a stable hand and called him holy. But Stephen called them saints before they even knew how to pray. And so they came. By June, his following had swollen to over 30,000. That is not the number you will find in royal chronicles. The scribes will write a rabble, a mob, a horde of beggars. They will reduce them to ink and parchment. But I saw them. I walked beside them. They were not numbers. They were names. Gaspard, the one-eyed charcoal burner who carried a wooden cross the size of a wagon. Marie, the widow with 6 children strapped to her back like satchels. Ellie, the Jew who walked in silence at the back of the crowd, disguised as a Christian, hoping to reach the sea and flee. And my brother Jahan, sharp-boned, angry, restless. His mouth was always full of questions. His fists, too often, full of stones. We were told we would walk to Marseille, where the sea would part, just as it had for Moses. We would walk across the dry bed to Jerusalem. The Holy Land would fall into our hands without a fight. And if the infidels resisted, God would send angels in armor. It sounds mad now, of course. But back then, it sounded like hope. On the 3rd Sabbath of June, we reached Orleans. The bishop there refused us entry. Said Stephen was a false prophet. Said no child could carry the cross. His gates remained shut, his sermons full of warnings. We camped outside the walls for 3 nights. On the 4th, someone set fire to the vineyards. No one saw who did it. But Stephen said nothing. He did not condemn it. He did not bless it. He simply looked at the flames and said, God clears the path. That night, I saw Jahan praying. My brother had never prayed before, not even when our mother died, not when our father disappeared in the war against Flanders. But there he was, kneeling in the grass, eyes shut tight. What are you doing? I asked him. He didn't look up. Praying the sea will part. You believe it will. He nodded. Why else would God make me a shepherd's son? Why else would I be hungry every day of my life? There must be something better. I wanted to believe him. I did. But something in me, even then, had begun to darken. Because even as he prayed, I could hear the coughing of the sick beside us. I could see the crows circling above the camp, not waiting for a miracle, but for meat. And in the shadows of the oak trees, I saw men sharpening blades not for Saracens, but for the next town that refused us bread. When we left Orleans, we were not the same. The people of the town had seen the fires and grown afraid. They gave us meat, wine, a priest to bless the march. Not out of kindness, but out of fear. And that changed us. We were no longer pilgrims. We were a force. Stephen began riding on a mule, surrounded by guards. They wore no armor, only wool cloaks dyed red. But they carried clubs wrapped in iron. They said they were peacekeepers. They said it was to protect the shepherd king. But peacekeepers do not beat bakers for raising prices. Peacekeepers do not burn the homes of those who cannot recite the creed. And when an old woman was found hanged in her orchard with a scroll pinned to her chest that read, Blasphemer, even the priests among us went silent. I remember one priest, Brother Arnell, a Benedictine, thin as a reed and always clutching his psalter like a child's toy. He had joined us at Chartres, saying God had shown him a vision of a new kingdom, one led by the innocent. After the hanging, I found him weeping beneath a tree. This is not what I saw, he whispered. This is not the dream. What did you see? I asked. He shook his head. Not this. He left the next morning, just walked into the woods and never came back. I often wonder what became of him. Did he find peace? Or did the wolves of France find him first? By the time we reached Limoges, we were too large to ignore and too desperate to stop. The nobles had begun sending letters to Paris, demanding the king act. But Philippe did nothing. Some say he saw the movement as a way to distract the masses from his failings. Others say he feared that moving against the shepherds would make him look like an enemy of the cross. So we marched on, unchallenged, unpunished. Behind us, burned villages, broken synagogues, graves dug without names. Ahead of us, the sea. We believed it would part. We had to, because if it didn't, if the dream was a lie, then all we had left was dust and hunger and death. You don't notice when a river becomes a flood. Not at first. It begins with a trickle, a few drops of excitement, a splash of prophecy, a stream of people with empty bellies and full hearts. But then the rains come. The banks swell. The land groans. And suddenly, you realize there is no more land. There is only water, and it is carrying you whether you want to move or not. That's how the Shepherds Crusade marched across France. It was no longer just a boy with a vision. It was a nation's misery turned loose. And by July, the flood had begun. We left Limoges in full voice. Bells rang from the steeples as we passed. The townspeople stood at their gates and watched in stunned silence. Some crossed themselves, others spat on the ground. They had heard stories. Some said we were children of God. Others said we were demons dressed in peasant skin. I don't blame them. If you had seen the procession, you might not have known what to believe either. Imagine it. 30,000 people, boys, girls, mothers, widows, cripples, thieves, monks, dogs, goats, rats, all moving together like a single groaning beast. Crosses made of branches strapped to backs, painted banners with smudged saints and bleeding hearts. A robed figure at the center, riding a white mule. Stephen, no longer a shepherd but a king in all but crown. They sang as they walked. Psalms and folk hymns. 100 different dialects, all shouting the same hope. To the sea, to Jerusalem. But beneath the hymns, you could hear it, the other sound. The hunger, the murmurs, the hiss of anger boiling just under the surface. It was only a matter of time. I remember one night near Montauban. The heat had settled on the land like a curse. Flies blanketed our food before we could eat it. The young ones were weak from sunstroke. Water was running low. And then came the argument. A baker from the rear caravan accused a traveler of stealing barley. It should have ended with words. Instead, it ended with blood. The thief was a boy no older than 10. When they dragged him before Stephen, we expected justice, a warning, perhaps even mercy. Instead, Stephen raised a hand and said, "Let God judge him." The crowd took that as permission. The boy was beaten to death with walking sticks and belts. No one buried him. That night, we sang no songs. More joined us with each town we passed. And not just the poor, disgraced knights, hedge preachers, even merchants with ruined debts. They came for a second chance, or for absolution, or for something they couldn't name. The world was collapsing around them, and Stephen's march felt like the last road out of hell. But with numbers came chaos. Disputes over food, over space, over leadership. Some groups began forming their own factions, the Red Crossers, who wore bloody bands around their arms and spoke only in scripture. The Anointed Sons, led by a mad German who claimed he had kissed the feet of Christ in a dream. Even Stephen seemed overwhelmed. He no longer walked among us. He rode, high above, flanked by guards, surrounded by silence. I wondered if he still dreamed of the sea parting, or if, like the rest of us, he had begun to realize what we truly were. Not a crusade, a stampede. My brother Jahan changed during those weeks. He stopped smiling, stopped talking to me. His eyes had a strange brightness to them. Not joy, but something sharper. He clung to a group of older boys who called themselves the True Ones. They painted crosses on their faces with ash and said Stephen would one day be crowned pope. One day, I saw them dragging a woman behind a barn. She had refused to feed them. I chased after Jahan when it was over, grabbed his wrist. "Is this what God wants?" I asked him. He looked at me, really looked, and said, "God doesn't want anything. He just watches." And he walked away. Then came Albi. The town opened its gates to us. Out of fear or faith, I couldn't tell. We marched through the streets like saints returning from war. They gave us bread and cheese, wine and figs. We feasted like kings. And then, drunk on food and prophecy, the preaching began. Not Stephen this time. Others. One claimed he was the returned Elijah. Another said he had spoken to St. Louis in a dream, and that we would soon conquer Spain as well as Jerusalem. Then the murmurs came. "There are Jews here." It was always the same pattern. Every town, the rumor. Sometimes it was whispered by merchants looking to settle old debts. Sometimes it came from the guards themselves, hoping to earn favor. But always, it ended in the same way. In Albi, a crowd gathered outside the home of a moneylender. He was an old man, hunched and blind, known to most by name. I had seen him give bread to children. He kept to himself. They dragged him into the street, demanded he confess to hoarding relics. When he said he had none, they beat him. A woman screamed that she had seen him spit during Mass. Another claimed he had cursed her baby. Stephen did not intervene. He stood on the church steps, head bowed, hands clasped. The man was stoned to death. His house was looted. The bodies of his sons, I remember 2 of them, were thrown into the river. When the Bishop of Albi protested the violence, he was nearly hanged himself. We left the next morning. Behind us, smoke. By now, I had stopped pretending we were holy. This wasn't a march to Jerusalem. It was a fire. And Stephen was no longer a prophet. He was a spark. The flame had grown bigger than him, hotter than he could hold. The ones marching now, they didn't want to pray. They wanted to burn. We were 3 days from Toulouse. The sun above us like a hammer. The land before us cracked and dry. The people behind us starving, angry, mad. And ahead, the first city with real walls. Real armies. Toulouse would not open its gates. And what waited there would change everything. We saw Toulouse days before we reached her. Stone towers rising above the hills like fists. Crimson roofs slanted beneath the August sun. Walls, real ones, tall and solid, not the crumbling palisades we had seen in villages. Behind those walls, fear and power, and men with weapons who weren't starving. It was the first time I felt it. We might not win. The city was ready for us. That much was clear. We came down the road from Castres in a great heaving line, 30,000 strong, our banners torn from wind, our robes gray with sweat and dust. We sang hymns out of habit more than faith now. Most just muttered, their tongues too dry for song. Stephen rode ahead, as always, guarded, veiled, untouchable. And when the towers of Toulouse came into view, he raised a hand. "This is the last gate before the sea," he said. We didn't know then how prophetic that would be. They did not open the gates. Of course they didn't. Not for 30,000 vagrants, barefoot zealots, and hungry children armed with clubs and crosses. Not for rumors of miracles. Not for the boy whose words had already scorched half the country. The Archbishop of Toulouse had heard the stories. So had the magistrates and the merchants and the guards. They had no interest in being freed by shepherds who left ash in their wake. So the gates remained shut. The horns rang out a warning. And our people, who had eaten nothing but crust and wind for days, collapsed in the fields just outside the walls and waited. The sun baked the ground until the dirt cracked like a broken plate. Babies cried. Dogs snapped at rats. Men passed out in the shade of wagons. And then, as always, came the whisper. There are Jews inside the city. I don't know who started it this time. Maybe it was a boy looking for a reason to fight. Maybe it was one of the Red Crossers, half mad from sunstroke and zeal. Maybe it was whispered by one of the priests, careful not to say it too loud, but just loud enough. But once the words were out, they moved faster than fire. The Jews poisoned the wells. The Jews bribed the bishop to close the gates. The Jews are keeping food inside while we starve. We had heard it all before. And Toulouse, unlike the smaller towns, had a real Jewish quarter, walled off, guarded, known to all. It became the next target. That night, hundreds slipped from the camp and crawled to the city's east wall. Some had ropes. Others had carts. Some just had fire. They found a drain tunnel, small, old, half-collapsed, just wide enough for a thin man to crawl through. That's how they got in. Dozens at first, then more, like rats through cracks. By the time the city guard realized what had happened, it was already too late. The Jewish quarter of Toulouse burned before dawn. I remember the sky first, glowing red like a forge, though the sun was hours away. Then the sound, not the shouts, not the screams, but the song. Yes, they sang again, like they did in Limoges, in Albi, in Peronne. But this time it was different. The voices were louder, more frenzied. Not hymns now, but chants, savage and proud. God wills it. God wills it. I stayed behind, in the fields, watching from the hill with a dozen others too weak or too frightened to join. And I saw it all. Flames leapt from rooftop to rooftop. Figures ran in the alleys, some in white, others in nothing but smoke. I saw guards fighting with shepherd boys, men in armor hacking at boys with crucifixes drawn in charcoal across their chests. The bells of Toulouse rang not for mass, but for blood. And then I saw Jahan. He was on the wall, near the northern turret. His arm was bloodied. In his hand was a torch. He didn't look down. He just watched the flames. The fighting lasted 2 days. Toulouse was too strong to fall, but too proud to beg. By the time the city had sealed all breaches and pushed the shepherds back, over 100 were dead from both sides. Jews, Christians, guards, boys. The Jewish quarter was destroyed. What wasn't burned was looted. Women were dragged from their homes and tossed into the crowd. Men were killed in the street. Synagogue scrolls, some older than Stephen himself, were thrown into the river. No one was spared, not even the children. When the archbishop came to parley with Stephen on the 3rd day, his robes were stained with soot. He begged the shepherd king to end the march. He offered food, safe passage, even a ship, if only Stephen would leave. I was close enough to hear the words. Stephen didn't shout. He didn't preach. He simply said, "I walk where God commands." The archbishop, shaking, whispered back, "Then God is blind." Toulouse locked its gates for good after that. No ships were offered. No mercy given. We were driven from the city like animals. The army, once whole, now fractured. Some turned south, hoping to reach the coast by a different route. Some turned violent, forming war bands that raided villages along the Garonne. Some simply sat down on the road and wept. And some, like me, just kept walking, not knowing why. I found Jahan that night. He was sitting by the river, silent, his face blackened by soot, his tunic torn. I didn't ask what he'd done. I didn't want to know. I only asked, "Did you see him?" Jahan didn't look up. "Who?" "God," I said. He laughed, a broken, bitter laugh. Then he turned and said something I will never forget. God wasn't in Toulouse. Just men, and fire, and ash. We left the next morning. Toulouse disappeared behind us in smoke and memory. But the crusade, if we could still call it that, would never be the same. The dream was burning, and there was still the sea ahead. After Toulouse, the march staggered like a wounded beast. The songs were gone. The smiles, too. Most of the young had stopped speaking altogether, their eyes hollowed out by hunger and ash. Some still followed Stephen, trudging along in silence. Others had drifted away, toward the coast, toward the forests, or into the arms of outlaw bands that roamed like wolves behind us. I stayed. Not for Stephen. Not for God. For Jahan. He had changed. Not in rage. No, that had always burned inside him. But now, there was a strange calm in him. A quiet coldness. He still walked near the front, still wore the torn white cloth of the march, but he no longer looked at Stephen like a savior. Now he looked at him like a puzzle, like a boy watching a dying fire, unsure whether to smother it or feed it. We passed through smaller villages where the name Stephen was no longer greeted with cheers, but with fear, and sometimes arrows. In one town, they hung a scarecrow dressed as a shepherd, a sign nailed to its chest. False prophet, false king. No one dared touch it, not even Stephen. By the time we reached Narbonne, less than half remained. Some starved, some fled. Many were dead, some from violence, others from fever. The river Garonne had claimed dozens who tried to bathe in its waters, only to fall ill and rot from the inside out. The heat was unbearable. Skin cracked from sun. Feet bled through sandals. We had long since stopped burying the dead. We simply kept walking. And then we met him. He appeared on the third morning after Narbonne. We were camped in a hollow near a ruined abbey, the air thick with flies and smoke from damp fires. A voice rang out from the broken gate. Brothers, not a child's voice, not a priest's. A man's voice, smooth, confident, sharp as wine. He wore no armor, but moved like one who had seen war. His cloak was black, trimmed in red. His beard was trimmed, but his eyes were wild. He rode a black mare, flanked by two men carrying what looked like relics, bone fragments, maybe, or bits of cloth. One even bore a chalice wrapped in leather. He dismounted and walked straight to Stephen. I am Bishop Hugo of Carcassonne, he said. I saw Stephen flinch. There is no Bishop Hugo in Carcassonne, he said. The man smiled. There was once. The truth unraveled quickly. He had once been a priest, perhaps even a bishop, though the church had excommunicated him years ago. No one knew exactly why. Some said he preached that saints were frauds. Others said he performed mass with blood not his own. Some whispered that he consorted with heretics in the Pyrenees. All we knew was this. He had no fear, and he spoke with authority. The church fears you, he told Stephen that night, by firelight. And fear is proof of power. Stephen remained silent. You are no longer a boy with visions. You are a vessel, and vessels must be emptied or used. There were no sermons, no chants, just that voice. Soft, poisoned with honey. I hated him the moment I saw him. But others, many others, did not. By the end of the week, Hugo had become Stephen's shadow. He rode beside him, whispered before speeches, laid hands on the sick, then blamed their death on doubt. The children began calling him the Red Monk. Some of the priests protested and quietly disappeared. Even Jahan began to listen. He speaks sense, my brother said one night. He doesn't talk about miracles. He talks about revenge. Revenge? I asked. Jahan stared at the stars. For the poor. For all of us. And then came the anointing. It happened in a ruined chapel near Béziers. Rain pounded the broken roof. Fires hissed in the mud. We gathered in a half circle, the air thick with incense, or maybe smoke. Hard to tell. Stephen stood in silence. Pale. Thin. His once boyish face hollow now, cheeks sharp, lips chapped. Hugo approached, holding a vial of oil. Not the chrism of Rome, but something darker, thicker, smelling of cloves and rot. He anointed Stephen's head. By the flame of wrath, Hugo said, I bless the shepherd king. The crowd was silent. Then someone clapped. Then others. Then they knelt. Jahan, too. Only I stood. Stephen looked at me. For a flicker, just a moment, I thought I saw something. Shame, doubt. But he said nothing. From that night, things changed. The sermons stopped. The punishments returned. Hugo had named new enforcers, not the boys from before, but men, grown men with scars and hard eyes. They didn't carry crosses. They carried whips. They called themselves the penitents. They wore black with red thread stitched in the form of a reversed crucifix. Their duty, they said, was to purge the weak, to prepare the march for the final crossing. Crossing where? We didn't know. The sea was close. We could smell it in the wind. But no one talked of Jerusalem anymore, only of judgment. The next town, Banyuls, refused us food. Hugo gave the order. They were unclean, he said. And so, for the first time, Stephen's army, no longer children, no longer holy, raised a town on purpose. Systematically. 3 days of fire. 10 men hanged. Women taken. The chapel defiled. The townspeople fled to the sea cliffs. Many jumped. The rest watched from the rocks as their lives burned behind them. That night, Hugo led mass. He poured wine onto the earth, called it the blood of the damned. He raised his arms and proclaimed, "Not every crusade saves. Some punish." And the crowd, wild, tired, lost, cheered. Jahan stood beside him, and I understood then. Whatever had begun in the hills of Cloyes with visions and light had ended here in black robes and ruin. The shepherd king was now a weapon, and the man who wielded him was no longer God. We had left Toulouse behind us, or thought we had, but Toulouse never left us. It clung to the march like ash in a wound, raw, red, and always itching. The flames, the screams, the faces of children who watched their homes vanish in fire. These things did not fade with distance. They fermented, and by the time we reached the coast, that rot had soaked all the way through. We reached the Mediterranean on the Feast of the Assumption. The sea was everything the prophecies had promised, blue beyond belief, shimmering like polished glass, as wide and vast as the sky. Many fell to their knees upon seeing it. They wept. Some believed it would part, even then. They waded in, waist deep, chanting, "Open, Lord," as you did for Moses. But the sea did not open. It never would. We camped near Aigues-Mortes, a port sweltering in salt and heat. It had once been a crusader harbor. The ghost of St. Louis himself was said to linger in its chapel. But there were no holy ships waiting for us now. Only fishing boats and weather-worn traders, who looked at us like plague. The local magistrate refused us entry, said we were dangerous. He was right. By now, only perhaps 10,000 remained, a third of what we once were. Most were boys barely clinging to their sandals. Some were girls disguised in rags. The rest were hollow-eyed men with burnt skin and twitching hands. Stephen said nothing, not when the magistrate turned us away, not when Hugo declared we would take the ships by force, not when the crowd began gathering torches and ropes. He just stared at the sea, like he was still waiting for it to part. That night, the fire started again. It wasn't just the harbor. It was the town, the homes, the chapels. Toulouse had been an explosion, but Aigues-Mortes was something else. It was a ritual, planned, precise. The Red Monks, Hugo's men, divided the town into quarters. Each was to be cleansed. One would burn, one would be looted, one would be spared to send word. The final quarter, the Jewish quarter, would be sacrificed. That was the word they used. Sacrificed, as if they were feeding the sea. Stephen did not order it, but he did not stop it. He stood by the water, barefoot, arms outstretched, as if waiting for some divine reply. Jahan was there too. I saw him speaking to Hugo, who smiled and handed him a lantern. Then my brother disappeared into the alleys. I followed. The city smelled of oil and smoke and salt. Flames licked at the timbers of merchant homes. Screams rang out behind shuttered windows. I saw one man thrown into a well, another tied to a cart and set alight. The chapel of St. Martin collapsed in on itself like a dying beast, its bell tolling one last time before melting in the fire. I found Jahan at the edge of the Jewish quarter. He was holding a torch, staring at the gate. His hands were shaking. "Don't," I said. He didn't look at me. "It's too late. You don't have to do this." He finally turned, and his face was a ruin. Not because of sorrow, but because he didn't know if he felt anything at all. "I'm not doing it for Hugo," he whispered. "I'm doing it because it's the only thing left." Then he dropped the torch. The fire rose so fast, it felt like the city itself had exhaled flame. Dozens died, maybe hundreds. No one kept count anymore. The docks burned, and with them the boats we had once dreamed would carry us to Jerusalem. The sea turned black with ash. By morning, the red monks were gone. So was Hugo. Some said he fled south to Spain. Others said he was killed by his own followers for blasphemy. One boy claimed he saw him walk into the sea, robes trailing behind him like wings, muttering a prayer to a god with no name. Stephen stayed, silent, motionless, a figure of soot framed against a dead harbor. I approached him, touched his arm. "Is it done?" I asked. His eyes met mine, empty. The sea did not open. It was the last thing I ever heard him say. We fled Aigues-Mortes under moonlight. No horn, no banner, no prayer. Only the crunch of boots on scorched gravel, the wet rasp of the dying, and the long silence that followed. Behind us, the harbor still smoldered. You could see the glow across the salt marshes. Flames licking the dark like tongues trying to speak. No one talked. Not even the red monks. What few of them remained. Some had vanished after the fire. Some had been knifed in the dark by their own. One, I saw with my own eyes, was crucified upside down on the frame of a burned fishing shack. The writing above him simply said, "Heretic." Even the march was rebelling now. But against who? No one was sure anymore. We drifted east, then north, a broken river of bodies, half mad and rotting from within. Some were trying to find a way home. Some were still waiting for the sea to open. Most were just walking, like ghosts, skin peeling, voices gone, food long since vanished. I remember the sound most of all, a soft, wet cough, always somewhere behind me. And the flies, so many flies. In alls, we were turned away by force, not even allowed near the gates. The guards had heard of Aigues-Mortes, and perhaps Toulouse before that. They fired arrows into our crowd before we even spoke. A woman was hit through the neck. A child trampled as we fled. After that, we stopped asking for shelter. We simply wandered. Stephen walked in the middle now, no longer at the front. He didn't preach. He didn't look up. Jahan stayed beside him, saying nothing. I think the two of them had become bound by something heavier than belief now, something more like burden or guilt. One night, Stephen collapsed in the mud, didn't speak, didn't rise. We waited. After some time, someone tried to help him up. He swatted the hand away, and then curled into the dirt like a dying lamb. He never spoke again. A week later, we came to a river, wide, slow-moving, choked with reeds and dark with summer rot. I don't know its name. Maybe it didn't have one. But along its bank we saw them. Bodies. First one, then three, then dozens, laid out in rows. Some still wore our symbols, crosses in red thread, tattered white robes, the sandals of the march. Some had been stripped, others beheaded. Many bore signs of torture, burned eyes, broken hands, branded flesh. Jahan froze. So did I. These were our people. A boy approached us. He had no shoes and a swollen face. Looked no older than 11. They caught them, he said. Who? Soldiers. From Avignon. The bishop there. He sent men to hunt us. Jahan's voice was dry. Why? The boy shrugged. Because we made God angry. That night, I sat beside the river and stared at the rows of corpses. I counted 60 before I stopped. I was trying to find faces I knew. I hoped I wouldn't, but part of me hoped I would, just to prove we hadn't imagined it all. That was the first massacre. More followed. By now, the Pope had condemned us. So had the king. Every bishop from Limoges to Marseille had issued edicts calling the march heresy. They called Stephen a fraud, a demon, a plague. And with that proclamation came hunters, knights, mercenaries, churchmen with iron and permission. One by one, they picked us off. At Pont Saint-Esprit, 50 were burned alive. At Montélimar, the town militia sealed a cave entrance with 100 inside. Near Vienne, a priest invited marchers into his chapel for sanctuary, then barred the doors and set it alight. I was in that chapel, but I got out. Jahan dragged me through a side window. My hair was burned. My arm never healed right. Stephen never tried to escape. They found him kneeling at the altar, mouth open as if he was still waiting for an answer. They did not kill him right away. No, they paraded him, in chains, through town after town. The shepherd king, the boy blasphemer. People threw dung at him, stones. Some spat in his mouth. In Lyon, he was forced to kneel before the bishop and kiss his feet. In Dijon, They tied a dead lamb around his neck and made him carry it through the square. He didn't weep, didn't scream, didn't speak. And then, finally, he was brought to Paris. They executed him in the Place de Grève, not as a prophet or king, but as a criminal, a common fraud. No one was allowed to record his final words. But the rumor, the one I believe, is that he said this: "I did nothing. It was all of you." And then they hanged him. Jahan disappeared the day Stephen was taken. Some say he went south, became a mercenary in the Pyrenees. Some say he joined the Cathars, or what was left of them. Some say he died in the river. I don't know, but I still wake sometimes to the sound of his voice, saying that same phrase. It's the only thing left. As for me, I walked back to Cloyes. It took 3 months. No one recognized me, not even my own mother. The roads were empty when I returned. Not just of people, of memory. Cloyes was smaller than I remembered. The fields were browner, the trees shorter, the sky not as wide. It felt as though the world had shrunk while I had stretched into something it no longer recognized. I didn't go home right away. I wandered the edge of town for a week, sleeping in barns, pretending to be a pilgrim, just another beggar passing through. Even though I knew I wasn't passing through. Not anymore. I visited the church first, the one where Stephen had first spoken, where he had lifted his arm toward heaven and said, "God has chosen the low." It was locked, boarded up, in fact. A crude sign on the door read, "Closed for re-sanctification. Do not enter." Sanctified, it had once been filled with children who believed in heaven. What more could they want? I sat on the steps until dusk, hoping to hear something. A hymn, a footstep, even a bird. Nothing, only the wind. I found my way home eventually. My mother opened the door. She looked old, much older, not in her face, but in her posture. Her eyes barely met mine before they looked past me again, as if expecting someone else. "Jahan," she whispered. I shook my head. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. Just opened the door wider. I stayed in Cloyes for years. Worked as a scribe for the priest who replaced Father Anselm. He had no interest in the crusade. Called it a footnote in error. A heretical accident, like a smudge on a holy page. But people remembered. Quietly. Farmers spoke of lost sons. Mothers lit candles for daughters who had vanished into the fire. Some cursed Stephen. Some prayed for him. Most said nothing. But I knew. They remembered. Word of the Shepherds Crusade faded over time. The church tried to erase it. No mention in most records. No celebration. No mourning. Only one letter from Pope John XXI remains, calling the march a great scandal and deception that must be forgotten. It worked. For a while. But not forever. I began writing this story many years later, when my hair had gone gray and my hand shook when I held a quill. I wrote in secret, in the attic of the rectory, copying the story onto old parchments and hiding them under the floorboards. Not for glory, not for revenge, only so that someone, someday, might remember what we were, what we became, what we lost. They called us lambs. They said we were innocent. But the truth? We were angry. We were cold. We were poor. And someone told us that was holy, that if we only walked far enough, if we only shouted loud enough, the sea would open. But it never did. Stephen of Cloyes died by hanging. Jahan was never found. The sea remained closed. And I am the last witness. Not because I survived, but because I still remember. And if memory is a kind of mercy, then let this be our prayer. May no child ever be told again that suffering is sacred, and may no prophet ever again speak in the voice of hunger.